this lesson specifically is on conceptual understanding of the term reflective practitioner. You must have all been hearing about reflective practice, reflecting as a teacher. The NCFTE, National Curriculum Framework for Teacher Education 2009, has titled its document as Preparing a Reflective and Humane Teacher. So, it is to that end that we will be focusing our lesson now on. So, what is reflective practice? Why is reflective practice important in the teaching profession? And how does one become a reflective teacher? So, if we focus on what is reflective practice, it was John Dewey in the early 20th century who popularized the notion of reflective practice in education. And I quote him, "Reflective practice entails decision making in the immediate context." Dewey talks about three kinds of action. One is impulsive action, which is basically based on trial and error. So, something works today, we assume that it will work tomorrow. Routine action, that is traditional ways of doing something. Something has been working for a long period of time, so it will work for me as well. And the third kind of action, he calls it as the reflective action, which basically arises as a need to solve problems. It involves persistence and careful consideration of our own practice. Donald Shawn is another person who brought reflection into the center stage of professional knowledge, and he brought in the terms reflection in action and reflection on action. So, reflection in action, according to Shawn, is something that we do while in action. So, it is the split second decisions that we make and that we reflect on immediately, on the go, as it were. So, reflection on action is something that we do after the completion of an action. So, specifically in the teaching context, reflection in action is deciding what is it that we are going to give a particular student when she asks a question, or a particular student is stuck with a problem. So, how do we help her solve then and there? So, the kind of decisions that we make there, and immediately for us, all this happens within a second. So, within that second we make the decision and immediately we reflect if this decision is the right decision that we have made. So, that is reflection in action. Reflection on action happens after we complete the lesson and sit back and think how the lesson went, where it went wrong, how could it have been better, or where it went right, why did it go right. So, these are the kinds of questions that frames reflection on action. Van Menen is another educator who is given a hierarchy of reflective practice. The hierarchy is like this: technical, practical and critical. So, technical, what I just told you now, what went right, what went wrong and why. The practical